I was in a regional archive cross-referencing civic records for an unrelated task, when I stumbled upon a late 19th century black and white photograph, judging by the emulsion quality, of a statue unveiling. The monument showed a man in period attire, from the early 1800s perhaps even earlier, holding what looked like architectural tools on a classical plinth in a dignified posture. The inscription simply stated the architect, not Architect Jones or in memory of Samuel Richardson, master builder, just the architect. The caption offered no further details. Municipal dedication ceremony, nothing more. I should have moved on, but I didn't. The deeper I delved, the more I discovered. Not isolated instances, not scattered curiosities. A pattern. A pattern that repeats with unsettling precision across numerous cities, multiple continents, and different administrative regions that ostensibly had no coordination with each other. Monuments to the physician, the scholar, the engineer, the writer, the composer. Anonymous tributes, unnamed honours. Statues erected at considerable public expense. These were costly endeavours requiring committee approval, public funding and skilled artisans, all dedicated to individuals who, according to every official record I could find, never existed. The official explanation is straightforward, elegant even. These monuments, we are told, represent ideals rather than specific people. They are allegorical, symbolic homages to professions, to abstract concepts of learning and civic contribution, the kind of neoclassical symbolism popular in the 18th and 19th centuries. Think of Lady Justice. No one asks for her birth certificate. And frankly, that explanation should work. It should, but it doesn't account for the specifics. The actual allegorical statuary from the same era which honours concepts looks distinct. These are stylized, idealized, often feminine figures in classical robes embodying commerce, liberty or justice. Their faces are generic, their clothing timeless, their poses theatrical. These other statues, the unnamed ones, are portraits, specific faces, individual characteristics, period-appropriate clothing that places them not in timeless allegory but in distinct decades. One statue features a man in what textile historians identify as 1790s fashion. Another portrays someone in attire consistent with the 1740s. These are not abstract ideals, these are actual people wearing genuine clothes from specific historical periods, immortalised in bronze and stone, honoured with public ceremonies and municipal funds, and then systematically stripped of their names. Not their faces, not their professions, just their names. This is where the official explanation completely falls apart. These monuments appear across an impossibly vast geographical expanse. I've documented them in urban records from what we now call Eastern Europe, Western Europe, parts of Asia and scattered reports from the Americas, though many of those are harder to verify. Either the statues themselves are gone or the records are suspiciously incomplete. The pattern is too consistent, the timing too synchronized. Throughout the mid to late 1800s, city after city, town after town erected these monuments. Not over centuries, but over decades. Sometimes within the same few years, different sculptors, different committees, different municipal governments, all independently decided to honour the physician or the scholar with identical anonymity. The probability of this happening by chance approaches zero. Let me be precise about what I am describing here. This isn't like an architectural style spreading through cultural exchange. That happens organically, slowly, through trade routes, pattern books and travelling artisans. This is a coordinated narrative, synchronized storytelling. Multiple cities, often with minimal interaction, somehow all simultaneously deciding to commission expensive public monuments, to dedicate them to unnamed individuals, to dress those individuals in period-specific historical garments, to honour them with identical generic titles, to provide no biographical information whatsoever, to maintain this convention for decades, all without proper documentation of why and all while pretending this was normal. Once you perceive it, you cannot unsee it. Allow me to elaborate on what I discovered when I categorised these monuments by profession. The architect appears most frequently. Dozens of documented examples, possibly more that have been destroyed or misidentified. Always male, always depicted with drafting tools or architectural plans. Often positioned near significant buildings that themselves have questionable attribution in official histories. The physician, the scholar, the engineer, the writer, the composer. These professions recur, not randomly, not with the variation you would expect if different cities were independently choosing symbolic figures. It's the same roles, the same poses, the same generic titles. And then there are the anomalies, those that don't quite fit the pattern. The navigator found in what are now landlocked regions. The cartographer in places where official history insists no significant mapping took place. The chronicler, that's an unusual choice, isn't it? Why would cities in the 1880s honour anonymous historians unless there were histories that needed to be re-examined, rewritten, attributed elsewhere? The pattern repeats, but it also hints that each profession suggests not only what was being honoured, but also what was being erased. Not all of these monuments survived. Some vanished in the early 20th century. Wars, urban renewal, shifting political climates, all plausible explanations. However, the pattern of which ones were destroyed is suspicious. The monuments that remain tend to be the more abstract ones. The writer holding a quill, the physician with period-appropriate medical instruments, vague enough to be reinterpreted as purely symbolic. The ones that disappeared were more specific, more detailed. I found references in old city records to monuments that included additional elements. Maps showing territorial boundaries that don't align with official histories. Astronomical instruments calibrated to observations that weren't supposed to be possible yet. Architectural elements that reference building techniques attributed to later periods. Those are gone now. Archival whispers hint at something similar with statues. A 1920s council minute mentions removal of the monument per directive. No explanation, no elaboration. It had stood for 47 years, then it didn't. Another fragment. A statue formerly known as something else, rededicated, recarved. The maps it held replaced with different objects. A new plaque, a new story. Not destroyed but repurposed, which might actually be more telling. If these were merely allegorical symbols, why the need to alter them? Why incur the expense of physical modification? Unless the allegory itself had become problematic. Unless what was being symbolized could no longer be publicly acknowledged. I've scrutinized dozens of these monument inscriptions. What they don't say is as crucial as what they do. Standard monument practice, even for purely symbolic statues, includes dates. Erected 1885, in the year of our Lord 1877, something to ground the monument in time. Many of these have no dates at all, or they have dates that create inconsistencies. A statue of the engineer dedicated in 1889, but the figure's clothing and tools date to approximately 1750 to 1780. Why commemorate a 19th century ideal of engineering by depicting someone from a century earlier? The common explanation that the sculptor was merely depicting period costume for aesthetic reasons collapses under scrutiny. Some of these statues display technological details that were supposedly not in use during the period the clothing represents. Instruments, tools, specific types of measurement devices. The evidence suggests something much larger. These monuments were created to preserve specific individuals while simultaneously obliterating their identities. Not to honour the abstract concept of architecture, but to acknowledge a particular architect while ensuring that architect could never be researched, verified or linked to specific buildings and achievements. Preservation through anonymity. Memory through forgetting. Let me tell you about the gaps. Municipal archives from the 19th century are typically exhaustive, tediously comprehensive. Permits for street vendors, records of minor property disputes, pages and pages documenting the mundane machinery of civic life. But around these monuments there are gaps. Missing committee minutes, lost correspondence, documents damaged by water or destroyed in fire. Or simply, whereabouts unknown. Always the documents that would clarify the decision-making process. Always the records that might contain names, biographical details, justifications. The sculptor contracts survive, the expense reports survive, the dedication ceremony programs survive, the explanations don't. I've spoken with archivists quietly and carefully about these gaps. Most haven't noticed the pattern, why would they? Each gap taken individually is unremarkable. Archives have gaps, documents get damaged, lost, misfiled. But when I describe the specific pattern, documents related to these specific monuments across multiple archives in multiple countries, some of them pause. One archivist, older, nearing retirement, looked at me for a long moment and said, "You know, I always wondered about that." Then she changed the subject. She wondered, but she didn't investigate. Nobody investigated. Here's something I couldn't ignore. Some of these monuments are sculpted in styles that predate their official creation dates by decades. Not slightly outdated, but dramatically. So statues from the late 19th century, according to municipal records, are executed in sculptural styles consistent with 1820s neoclassicism. Not a revival, not an homage. The actual technique, the actual approach, as if the sculptor learned their craft 70 years earlier. How? One possible explanation, the statues themselves are older than their official unveiling dates. They were created earlier, stored and then installed later with manufactured provenance. Another explanation, the sculptors were working from much older models or sketches, reproducing existing monuments that needed to be replaced, updated with new, or rather no, names. Either way, we return to the same implication. These monuments are preserving something older than their official history suggests. And that's where the entire edifice of symbolic allegory becomes impossible to ignore for what it truly is, a cover story. Map these monuments and you observe something else, something the official explanation cannot accommodate. They cluster not around capitals, not around major cultural centres, though some appear there too. They cluster around specific types of cities, trading hubs that existed along routes that official history claims were minor or insignificant. Port cities that supposedly weren't major ports during the period the monuments commemorate. University towns where the university's official founding dates post-date the periods depicted in the statue's clothing and instruments. The monuments signify something, not abstract ideals but places, specific locations where specific people accomplish specific deeds that can no longer be officially acknowledged. The navigator in a landlocked region, perhaps it wasn't always landlocked, or perhaps the routes being navigated weren't waterways. The cartographer in a provincial town, perhaps that town was more significant than current maps suggest. The pattern implies a network, a web of connected places, connected professions, connected knowledge, all systematically severed from official history. I mentioned earlier that some monuments were destroyed. Let me be more precise about what I found. There are photographs, not many, but enough to establish a pattern. Primarily from the 1920s and 1930s, these images show demolition crews, statues being removed from pedestals, loaded onto wagons, hauled away, and in some cases actively broken apart. What's noteworthy is the meticulous care taken in other demolitions of that period. When genuinely historically significant monuments were removed for urban renewal, there are records, discussions about preservation, debates about relocating rather than destroying. Museums acquired pieces, private collectors purchased fragments. For these unnamed monuments, nothing. They were removed and they vanished. No museums interested in the architect, no collectors seeking the physician, just gone. Let's address what I haven't found. No debunking campaigns, no official explanations published to counter alternative theories. No government statements clarifying the purpose of these monuments. Silence. When other historical anomalies or conspiracy theories emerge, there are responses. Academic papers explaining the conventional understanding. Museum exhibits addressing misconceptions. Official histories being defended or clarified. For these monuments, nothing. Ask a local historian about the architect statue in their city's main square and you'll get a shrug. Oh, that old thing. It's just decorative, I think, symbolic of civic pride or something. Ask why it's dressed in 1780s clothing when erected in 1890 and you'll get another shrug. Artistic choice, probably. Ask why there are dozens of nearly identical monuments across multiple continents and you'll get puzzled looks. Because most local historians don't know about the others, they know their statue. They've never considered the pattern. This silence isn't conspiratorial, it's ambient, structural. The kind of unawareness that doesn't require active suppression because everyone has already agreed, without discussion, not to inquire. The chronology matters. These monuments appear most frequently between 1870 and 1895. A concentrated surge of monument construction across multiple continents, all adhering to the same pattern, all honouring the same anonymous professions. Then they cease, not gradually but abruptly. After 1895, I can find almost no examples of new, unnamed professional monuments being erected. The practice simply ends. Cities continued building monuments to named individuals, to military victories, to specific historical events, but the anonymous tribute stopped. Why? What changed in the mid-1890s that made these monuments unnecessary, impossible, or too dangerous? One possibility: whatever was being preserved had been sufficiently expunged from official history that the monuments themselves became redundant or too conspicuous. Another possibility: the generation that comprehended what these monuments represented was passing away. Their children, raised on the new official histories, wouldn't recognise the significance. The monuments would become genuinely symbolic, genuinely anonymous. Their original purpose lost to time. Perhaps that was the objective: create the monuments while memories still lived. Honour the unnamed while people still remembered the names. Then wait. Wait for memory to diminish. Wait for the official history to fully supersede the remembered one. Wait until the architect becomes merely the architect, a symbol, an ideal, a decoration. Wait until no one asks anymore. I reflect on knowledge. Not abstract knowledge, but specific technical knowledge. The kind embedded in the hands of practitioners, in the methods of craftspeople, in the approaches of thinkers who don't leave written treatises. In surviving photographs of certain statues, figures hold instruments that don't quite make sense. Period-appropriate surveying equipment, yes, but configured in ways experts can't fully identify. Maps showing projections slightly off from standard methods or slightly correct in ways that shouldn't have been accessible yet. Astronomical instruments resembling astrolabes but with additional elements, modifications, purposes unknown. What did they know? What were they measuring? What were they calculating? We can't ask them. We don't even know their names. But someone deemed their knowledge important enough to honour publicly. Someone thought their contribution significant enough to immortalise in bronze and stone. And then someone else thought their identity dangerous enough to systematically erase. Both things can be true. I've avoided the obvious question. Let me address it now. Why would anyone want to erase these figures while simultaneously preserving their monuments? The official narrative that these are purely symbolic demands that we believe in an impossible coordination. But the alternative, that something was deliberately concealed, requires us to ask, hidden from whom and why? One framework suggests these monuments preserve the memory of a recent past that contradicted a newly established historical narrative. The figures couldn't be named because their documented achievements, their verified existence, would create inconsistencies in whatever new official history was being promoted. But their contributions couldn't be entirely erased without being noticed. Too many people still remembered, too many buildings still stood that bore their influence. Too many technological advancements couldn't be explained without acknowledging their work. The solution: preserve the honour while erasing the identity. Create monuments that acknowledge contribution without attribution. Let the names fade while the vague recollection of achievement remains. Within 1 or 2 generations, the disconnection would be complete. Future historians would see the architect and assume symbolism. The actual architect, their name, their biography, their specific buildings would be lost. All that would remain is stone and bronze and a vague sense that someone, sometime, did something worth remembering, just not worth naming. I sometimes stand in city squares gazing up at these anonymous faces. Bronze oxidizing green, stone weathering smooth, features that once represented specific individuals now softening into abstraction through time and rain. Tourists walk past without a glance. Pigeons roost on their shoulders. City planners discuss removing them to make way for modern sculpture. They're just decorations now. That's what we've been informed. That's what we believe. But I can't shake the sensation that I'm looking at ghosts. Not metaphorical ghosts, actual preserved impressions of people who existed, who contributed, who mattered enough for cities across continents to honour them publicly. People whose names we'll never know, whose achievements we cannot verify, whose very existence has been rendered debatable. The monuments endure, the people are gone, and the chasm between those two facts is where the enigma resides. I don't know what was erased. I don't know why it was erased. I don't know who decided that the architect could be honoured but not named, preserved but not remembered, acknowledged but never researched. I only know that it occurred systematically, deliberately. Recently enough that photographs exist, but long enough ago that memory is faded. And I know that when I inquire about these monuments, when I highlight the patterns, the timing, the coordination, the gaps in records, the stylistic anachronisms, the distribution that implies a network rather than coincidence, I am met with that same ambient silence. Not hostility, not denial, just disinterest. As if the questions don't matter. As if some part of us already knows that certain things aren't meant to be scrutinised too closely. Many of the statues are simply gone or destroyed, but some stand. They will likely stand for decades more, perhaps centuries, silent witnesses to something we've agreed without discussion to forget. And perhaps that was the entire intention, not to completely conceal the past but to render it unexaminable, present yet unreachable, visible yet incomprehensible, to transform history into decoration, to transform people into symbols, to transform names into silence. Mission accomplished. But the stone faces remain, watching, waiting, unnamed but not quite forgotten, not yet.